I didn't stop asking because I stopped caring. I stopped because every question made me feel more alone, and the scariest part wasn't the silence. It was realizing he was comfortable in it. I don't remember the exact day I stopped asking. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. There wasn't even a clear decision. It happened quietly. So quietly that I didn't notice it at first. I just remember waking up one morning and realizing there was a question I didn't ask anymore. Not because I already knew the answer, but because I was afraid of it. At the beginning, I asked all the time. I asked because I cared, because I wanted to feel close, because I believed that if I spoke, if I explained, if I tried hard enough, we would eventually meet in the same emotional space. I asked things like, "Do you miss me?" Not in a needy way, just softly, like someone reaching out to check if the other person is still there. Sometimes I asked, "Are we okay?" I didn't ask because something was wrong. I asked because something felt missing, and I didn't know how else to name it. At night, lying next to him, I asked, "Can we talk for a bit?" Not about anything specific, not about problems, just talk. I thought talking was how people stayed connected. At first he answered, not deeply, not warmly, but enough to make me believe I wasn't alone in trying. He would say things like, "Yeah, we're fine. You're overthinking. I'm just tired. Can we talk later?" Later became a familiar word. Later meant after work. Later it meant after dinner. Later it meant after his phone. Later meant another day. Later rarely came. I told myself it was normal. People get busy. Not everyone is expressive. Love doesn't always look the same. I adjusted. I learned to ask less directly. Instead of asking, "Do you miss me?" I said, "I was thinking about you today." Instead of, "Can we talk?" I said, "How was your day?" Instead of, "I feel lonely," I said nothing at all and waited to see if he would notice. I thought if I changed the way I asked, the answer would change too. But the answer stayed the same, short, distracted, unfinished. Sometimes he responded while scrolling on his phone, sometimes with his eyes on the TV, sometimes with a half nod that meant he heard sounds, not meaning. I started paying attention to the pauses, the way there was always a delay before he answered, the way he rarely asked anything back, the way the conversation always felt like it ended exactly where it started. I noticed that when I stopped talking, nothing rushed in to fill the silence. It just stayed silent. That was the first thing that hurt. Not that he didn't know what to say, but that he didn't seem to notice when I stopped saying anything at all. Still, I kept asking. I asked in different moods. I asked gently. I asked jokingly. I asked seriously. I asked after good days and bad days. I asked when I felt close to him and when I felt miles away. I asked because I believed relationships required effort from both sides, and asking felt like effort. I didn't realize yet that I was the only one making it. There was a night I remember clearly. We were sitting on the bed, the room dim except for a small lamp on the nightstand. He was on his phone. I was staring at the wall, counting how many seconds passed between the moments he looked up. I said, "Do you ever feel like we're drifting?" He didn't look up. He said, "No, just that." One word, no explanation, no curiosity, no follow-up question, just no. I waited. I thought maybe he would add something. He didn't, so I asked again, quietly, "Really?" This time he sighed, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to let me know I had asked one question too many. "I don't know why you always do this," he said. "Everything's fine." That was when I learned something important. When someone says everything's fine in that tone, what they really mean is, "I don't want to talk about this." And when they say it often enough, what they're really teaching you is, stop asking. But I didn't stop yet. I told myself he just communicated differently, that not everyone expresses love the same way, that actions matter more than words. So I started watching his actions. I noticed he remembered things that mattered to him. Deadlines, plans with friends, things he was excited about. I noticed how focused he could be when something interested him, and I noticed how absent he became when the topic was us. Still, I kept asking. I asked because part of me believed that if I stopped, I would disappear. Asking was proof I was still there, that my needs still existed, that I hadn't fully erased myself yet. Sometimes I asked in the middle of ordinary moments. In the kitchen, while he poured himself a drink, I said, "Do you still feel close to me?" He paused, then shrugged. "Yeah. Why?" Why? That word started to haunt me. Why do you need this? Why do you keep asking? Why isn't what I give you enough? I didn't have a clear answer. All I knew was that something felt incomplete, like I was standing in a room where the lights were on, but no one was home. I tried explaining once. I told him, "I don't need big gestures. I just need to feel like you see me." He nodded, said he understood. Nothing changed. The next time I asked, he reminded me, "We already talked about this." As if talking once should have fixed a feeling that had been growing quietly for months. I started to feel embarrassed about my questions, like each one revealed a weakness I should have learned to hide. I would rehearse them in my head before speaking. Is this reasonable? Am I asking too much? Should I just let it go? Sometimes I decided not to ask. I swallowed the question and told myself it wasn't important. But the questions didn't disappear. They just stayed inside me, piling up. I began to notice how tired I felt after every conversation about us. Not relieved, not closer, just tired. As if each attempt drained something from me and gave nothing back. One night I asked, "Do you ever miss me when I'm not around?" He laughed softly, not cruelly, almost kindly. "You're so dramatic," he said. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. Dramatic. As if missing someone you love is excessive. As if wanting to be missed is unreasonable. I laughed too, pretending it was a joke. But inside something tightened. I realized that every time I asked, I walked away feeling smaller. I started questioning myself more than the relationship. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I needed too much reassurance. Maybe I was the problem. The more I asked, the more I doubted myself. And still, I asked. Because not asking felt like giving up. And I wasn't ready to admit that maybe this was all there was. There was another moment I remember. We were out with friends. Everyone was laughing. The energy was light. Someone asked how long we'd been together. He answered easily, confidently. I smiled. Then the conversation moved on, and he turned away from me, engaged with someone else. I stood there, suddenly invisible. Later that night, when we were alone, I asked, "Do you feel connected to me?" He frowned. "What kind of question is that?" he said. "Of course I do." But his answer felt rehearsed, like something he said because it was expected, not because it was true. I nodded. I didn't push. I was learning which questions led nowhere, learning which ones made the air heavier, learning which ones made him pull away just a little more. I started choosing my words carefully. I asked less often. I softened my tone. I smiled more when I spoke. I tried to be easier to love. I thought maybe if I became less demanding, he would meet me halfway. But halfway never came. There was always a small distance between us. Not enough to leave, not enough to name, just enough to hurt. One evening, I almost asked something. We were lying in bed, facing opposite directions. I opened my mouth, then I closed it. The question stayed stuck in my throat. What would I even ask? Do you still love me? Do you notice how quiet I've become? Do you care that I'm slowly disappearing? I turned onto my side and said nothing. He didn't notice. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a subtle understanding settling in. I realized that asking wasn't bringing us closer. It was only reminding me how alone I felt. I still asked after that, but not the same way. The questions were fewer, the pauses longer. Each time I asked, there was a voice inside me whispering, "You already know." And that voice was getting harder to ignore. I began to anticipate his answers before he spoke. The sigh, the shrug, the reassurance without warmth. Knowing the outcome made asking feel pointless and painful. There was a day I caught myself stopping mid-question. I said, "Do you..." Then I stopped. He looked at me. "Do I what?" he asked. I smiled, shook my head. Nothing. He went back to what he was doing. That was new. I didn't ask again. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the things I hadn't said. They felt heavy inside me, like words pressing against my chest. But there was also something else. Relief. Asking had become exhausting. It took energy I didn't have anymore. Each unanswered question left a bruise you couldn't see. Not asking felt like protecting myself. I didn't stop asking because I stopped caring. I stopped because asking started to hurt more than the silence. But I didn't admit that to myself yet. I told myself I was being mature, that I was choosing peace, that not everything needed to be talked about. Deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't choosing peace. I was choosing numbness, and numbness felt safer than rejection. The questions still existed. They just lived inside me now, unspoken, unanswered. I learned to sit with them. I learned to smile without expecting anything back. I learned to stay quiet in moments where I used to reach out. And the scariest part was, he seemed more comfortable once I stopped asking. There was less tension, fewer conversations about feelings, more calm. He didn't ask why I'd gone quiet. He didn't ask what had changed. He didn't ask if I was okay. And that told me everything I was afraid to know. Because if my silence didn't bother him, then my voice probably hadn't mattered that much to begin with. I didn't stop asking all at once. It happened slowly, question by question, moment by moment, until one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had asked for anything at all. And part of me was relieved, and part of me was breaking. I was still there, still loving, still hoping, but something essential had already gone quiet, and I didn't know yet what that silence would cost me. When I stopped asking, I thought things would change. Not in a dramatic way. Not like in movies where silence suddenly scares the other person into noticing what they're about to lose. I thought my quiet would be loud. I thought he would feel the absence of my questions the way I felt the absence of his answers. But silence doesn't always echo. Sometimes it just disappears. At first, nothing seemed different. The days continued the same way they always had. We woke up next to each other. We shared meals. We talked about schedules, errands, plans. On the surface, we looked peaceful, maybe even better than before. There were fewer heavy conversations, fewer pauses filled with tension, fewer moments where I reached out and didn't feel anything reaching back. I told myself maybe this was what he needed. Space. Calm. Less emotional demand. I told myself that maybe my quiet was helping, but deep down something felt wrong, because when I stopped asking, he didn't lean in. He leaned back. He didn't notice the space I created. He simply occupied it. I started paying attention to the details, the small things that are easy to miss when you're still trying. I noticed how my messages got shorter. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to start conversations that would end halfway. I noticed how I stopped sharing my thoughts as they came. I used to tell him about random things, something I read, something I remembered, something that made me feel seen or small or unsure. Now I filtered everything. I asked myself before speaking, will this matter to him? Most of the time the answer was no, so I stayed quiet. And the quiet settled in fast. It filled the space between us like fog. Not thick enough to panic, just thick enough to blur everything. I remember one evening clearly. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. I was thinking about something that had happened earlier that day, something that hurt. Normally, I would have said something like, "Can I tell you about my day?" But I didn't. I waited. I waited to see if he would ask. Minutes passed. He laughed at something on the screen. I smiled too automatically. The moment passed. That was when I realized something important. If I didn't bring myself into the room, I wasn't there at all. He didn't notice my silence because my silence didn't interrupt anything for him. It fit perfectly into the life he was already living. I stopped asking, and the relationship didn't collapse. It just became quieter, and that scared me more than any argument ever had. I thought of all the times I had worried about being too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too needy. I wondered if this was proof that I had been right. Maybe he was happier now. Maybe this was the version of me that was easiest to love. The one who didn't ask. The one who didn't need. The one who didn't expect anything more than what was already being given. But loving that version of me came at a cost. I was disappearing inside it. I started to feel like a guest in my own relationship. Present but careful, polite. I didn't interrupt. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for reassurance. I laughed when it felt appropriate. I listened when he talked. I responded when spoken to. I existed in the spaces he made available. Nothing more. And the strangest part was how normal it all looked from the outside. If someone asked how we were doing, I said, "Good." And it wasn't exactly a lie. There is no obvious conflict, no constant fighting, no clear reason to leave, just a quiet emptiness that only I seemed to feel. At night, lying next to him, I stared at the ceiling. I used to turn toward him, hoping he would notice. Now, I turned away. Not out of anger, out of habit. I learned how to hold my feelings inside without letting them spill. I learned how to cry silently so it wouldn't disturb him. I learned how to feel lonely in the presence of someone who thought everything was fine. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed the change. If he saw that I spoke less, that I laughed differently, that I no longer reached for his hand first. If he did notice, he didn't say anything, and that silence spoke louder than any answer ever could. There were moments when I almost broke, when the weight of everything unsaid felt too heavy. Moments when I wanted to ask, "Do you see what's happening to me?" But I didn't, because I was afraid of what would happen if I asked and nothing changed again. Asking had taught me something. It had taught me how much rejection can exist without anyone raising their voice. I remembered all the times he had said, "You're overthinking." All the times he had minimized what I felt without being cruel. All the times he had stayed while being emotionally absent. And I understood something painful. He wasn't ignoring me because he didn't understand. He was ignoring me because he didn't need to understand. My feelings didn't disrupt his life. They only disrupted mine. I started to notice how easily he moved through his days, how light he seemed, how unaffected he was by the distance growing between us. And that hurt in a way I didn't know how to explain, because if my pain didn't touch him at all, what did that say about my place in his life? There was a moment that changed everything for me. It was small. So small that if I told someone else about it, they might not understand why it mattered. We were getting ready to go out. I was standing in front of the mirror, trying to decide what to wear. I felt insecure that day. Normally, I would have said something like, "Do I look okay?" Not because I needed praise, but because I wanted to feel seen. I opened my mouth, then I stopped. I waited to see if he would look up. He didn't. He was on his phone, completely absorbed. I stood there for a few more seconds, then I walked away. We left the house without him ever looking at me. That was the moment I realized how invisible I'd become. Not because I had changed, but because I had stopped asking to be noticed, and he had accepted that without question. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing someone is comfortable with your absence. Not your physical absence, your emotional one. He didn't miss my questions. He didn't miss my vulnerability. He didn't miss the parts of me that needed reassurance. Those parts had been inconvenient. My silence made things easier, and that truth settled into me slowly, like something heavy sinking to the bottom of my chest. I began to understand that emotional neglect doesn't always look like distance. Sometimes it looks like peace, a calm that exists because one person has stopped asking for more. I thought back to all the times I had blamed myself for wanting connection, for wanting depth, for wanting to feel chosen, and I realized something that broke me a little. I hadn't been asking for too much. I had been asking the wrong person. But even that realization didn't come with relief, because knowing doesn't erase the love. Knowing doesn't undo the attachment. I still loved him. I still cared. I just didn't bring those feelings into the room anymore. I kept them locked inside, where they couldn't be dismissed or misunderstood. But they also couldn't be met. I started living a double life. On the outside, I was calm, easy, low maintenance. On the inside, I was constantly negotiating with myself, telling myself not to ask, telling myself not to expect, telling myself to be grateful for what I had. I measured my needs and found ways to make them smaller. I convinced myself that wanting less was the same as growing. But shrinking yourself isn't growth, it's survival. And survival has a way of making everything feel temporary, even love. I noticed how I stopped planning for the future, not consciously, just quietly. I didn't imagine us years from now. I didn't picture long conversations or shared understanding. I only focused on getting through the present without hurting, without needing, without hoping, because hope had started to feel dangerous. Hope made me want to ask again, and I couldn't afford to do that. There was a night when he said something that stayed with me. We were talking about someone we knew who had broken up. He shook his head and said, "I don't understand why people make things so complicated." I smiled, but inside something cracked, because our relationship wasn't complicated. It was simple, too simple. Simple enough that my feelings didn't seem to fit inside it. I wondered if he thought I was complicated, if my emotions felt like unnecessary noise to him, if my silence was a relief. And the worst part was, I think it was. Because the quieter I became, the smoother things felt. And that told me everything I needed to know. I stopped asking, and nothing fell apart. No one chased after me. No one asked what was wrong. No one noticed that I was slowly giving up pieces of myself. The relationship didn't need my voice to continue. It only needed my presence, and that realization hurt more than any argument ever had. I started to grieve something I hadn't lost yet, the version of myself that believed love was a place you could speak freely. The version of myself that thought being heard was a basic part of being loved. That version of me felt very far away now. I wondered when exactly I had crossed the line from trying to understand him to trying to disappear for him. I wondered how long I could live like this, being with someone, but not being known, being loved, but not being met. I didn't stop asking because things got better. I stopped because I learned that my questions didn't matter enough to change anything. And that knowledge settled into me quietly. No drama, no confrontation, just a slow, aching clarity. I was still there, still loyal, still caring, but I was no longer reaching. And when I looked at him, I realized something that hurt more than anything else. He noticed my silence. He just didn't miss my voice. That was the truth I couldn't escape, because if he had missed it, he would have asked where it went, and he never did.